So welcome to this first panel. Emotional AI, empathic technologies, rights, children, and domestication. I'm thrilled. I'm really honored to be here, perhaps especially, because we're first on. In terms of the topic itself, the question of emotions, the question of affects, is something that personally I've been looking at for a number of years now. 5-6 years ago, it was kind of startups, it was kind of small businesses springing out of universities, making use and arguably exploiting these technologies. But I think what we've seen kind of in recent years is a real shift in industrial logics to where the much bigger players are taking a much keener interest in questions of emotion, questions of affect, and questions of physiological sensing. So in terms of the panel itself, we have a number of experts. We have Ben Bland on the far end, who's Chief Operations Officer at Sensum. They're an emotion and empathic technology company, but Ben also serves as chair of IEEE as well, particularly the P7014 group that's working to develop global standards around these technologists. We also have Dr. Giovanna Mascheroni, who's an associate professor of sociology at the Catholic University of Milan. She's part of the EU Kids Online project and part of the executive board and work package for an H2020 project, Wise Scales. And broadly, her work focuses on the social shaping, the social consequences of the internet, mobile media, and of the internet things and toys. We also have Gilad Rosner. Hand up. So Gilad is a privacy and information policy researcher and founder of the non-profit IoT Privacy Forum. Gilad's work focuses on lots of things, but includes identity management, privacy government, and emerging technologies. And recently he's been working on a project looking at the relationship between emotions and toys. He's also part of a group of experts working on OECD privacy guidelines. He's a visiting researcher at the Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute and co-founder of Elios, a consultancy providing ethics and privacy services to companies deploying emotional analytics. And finally, and certainly not least, we have Frederike Kaltheuner. She's been working on the intersection of emerging technology and justice for 7 years. She's currently a Mozilla Tech Privacy Policy Fellow. But before joining Mozilla, Frederike was director at Privacy International in London, where she led the organization's strategic work on corporate surveillance and emerging technology. So we're going to keep to time. I've been very strict on time. Each of the panelists has 10 minutes each because we want to leave as much time for questions as we can. So do make notes as you hear the speakers. Write down some questions and be sure to ask them. But can I begin, please, by introducing Ben?
Good morning. Is this on? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think as the kind of industry person out of the four of us, my hope is to try and set up a bit of the context here. So the sort of what, how, and why of empathic technology and what companies like ours are trying to sort of build and put out into the world before we focus in on some of the concerns and issues. Emotional AI and empathic technology essentially is software-driven systems that aim to measure. We can move on. There we go. That aim to measure, respond to, or simulate human affect, such as emotions, and the process of that essentially coming out of the field of affective computing is a sort of psychophysiological modeling process. So that is psychological models that explore the relationship between some kind of physiological signal, whether that's a facial expression or heart rate, or it could be text or body language or something like that, and how that relates to an affective state, such as an emotion. And then companies like ours are primarily building algorithms that mimic those psychophysiological models. So they look at a signal coming from a person and then try to infer how that person is feeling in response to a stimulus or just at that point in time. Right now, the actual use cases of such technologies are still, I would say, relatively unknown. I mean, there are products coming out onto the market and whatnot, but it's still a bit of a new field and extremely broad. I mean, we can imagine this kind of application in almost anywhere. I mean, health and wellness, for instance. There's this desire to help people improve on their emotional intelligence, if you want to call it that, or to improve mental state. Then there's games and media and entertainment, and we'll talk about toys especially and children's products, where the aim there is to sort of be able to respond dynamically to the person's current state, and likewise in consumer electronics, both in terms of like within the home, but also out in computers and whatnot. Likewise, there are some applications coming out in education broadly around attempting to optimize educational content based on how people are feeling, if they're getting bored or if they're engaged and so on. And we're seeing some use in public environments, especially through things like cameras, because they already exist in the public, attempting to read the moods of crowds and so on. I'll leave you to consider the ethical challenges there. And then one that I'll highlight, because it's particularly relevant to our company, for instance, is sort of mobility, that is transport, cars essentially. I mean, that's about 90% of what we're working on at the moment, where in the move towards more autonomous vehicles and smart vehicles, the aim is to be able to understand how the occupant of the vehicle is feeling, whether that be for, say, a safety requirement such as fatigue, falling asleep at the wheel, distraction, stress, and so on, or some kind of comfort or entertainment kind of process, essentially where the vehicle will respond to the person. Okay, this isn't comprehensive, but this is a list of some of the data types. In fact, these are all ones that we've worked with. There are others besides. But just to give a sense of the way in which some of this data is captured. So if you imagine, you could have a sensor on the body, such as a fitness wearable, for instance. A lot of people wear fitness bands now. A lot of the data they collect isn't necessarily that accurate on heart rate, but it's getting better by the day. And then there are new types of sensors like skin conductance and so on being added to them. But likewise, those signals can to some extent be detected with contactless sensors. So a regular camera, for instance, software behind the camera could be looking at the changes in color in your face and trying to detect your heart rate through that. Or something like it says ultra wideband there. So this idea of biometric radar. There's a chip that can detect movements in the body and then pass out from that something like your heart rate and breathing rate and so on. Very well known, I suppose, in this area is facial coding, which is essentially taking a video signal and then looking at motion of the face to detect emotional states, and likewise voice analysis. And in particular, I highlight those two because cameras and microphones are already ubiquitous. They're in vehicles, they're in the home, they're on your computer, they're on your phone and whatnot. So there's no new technology required to actually detect the signal. It's the software running behind it that, applying models, algorithmic models to it, that actually does the sort of clever bit. Whereas some of these would require new sensors to be added. So there's not necessarily user permission required in some cases. So then you could take a single signal, such as, say, an uptick in somebody's heart rate, and you could have a software running there that implies or infers that this person has become aroused or excited in some way. But it may not be an emotional signal at all. It could be that they've just drunk some coffee, or they've got up and run up the stairs, for instance. But then, of course, if, for instance, you had some way of telling what the person was doing at the time, say object recognition from the camera or something that showed their location or speed, you can use that as context to then apply to that signal and say, okay, in this case, the person is actually stationary in a gas station, therefore it's probably not interesting to monitor their change in heart rate. So not only do you have that context, but also if you can get more types of signals, say something from the camera, from the microphone, from physiological sensors, and then combine them together, you can start to infer more and more complex and nuanced states. And this is why I've sort of referred to states and affect rather than emotions, because people tend to think immediately of the sort of basic emotions of happy, angry, sad, and so on when they talk about emotions. But that is largely a sort of theory based around sort of 60s and 70s, I suppose, that infers that we all have these universal emotions. This is contentious now. More so these days, psychologists in the emotional field will be looking at things like appraisal models, that is, trying to understand the person or people and their history, their intentions, where they are at the time, what is around them. And if you imagine building those products and software, you can use context data from, it could be the user's personal profile of some sort, or it could be inferred in the moment from what is around them. And then you can get these complex states like arousal and valence from which you could infer your basic emotions if you wish to. Are you doing okay? Okay, so just to give you a sort of quick overview of the current ecosystem, on the academic side, this largely combines psychology, physiology, data science for the modeling side, and then computer science for actually deploying it. In tech, you've got the sensor companies, obviously. Then there are those that are actually analyzing the data, so it's largely a data science field. And then there's the surrounding digital infrastructure, whether that be for edge-based processing or connecting to cloud servers and so on. And the businesses that are working in this field, there's not a hell of a lot of startups, but you'll see that every month we're seeing new ones coming out, and they tend to be quite specialized around a particular type of data or a particular type of sensor. Increasingly, we're seeing that they're then starting to become more multimodal, as I mentioned, taking different data streams. And then there's obviously big tech, Google, Facebook, Apple, and so on, who have their own work going on and are also buying up some of these startups and presumably starting to combine their specialities in-house. And then on the sort of policy and government side, obviously this is very new, and there's not a lot out there in terms of well-defined policy and legislation. We are involved with some of that in terms of standards, at least, as Andy mentioned, working with the IEEE on developing standards. And I think the big challenge there is how do we define standards for a field that hasn't really discovered its killer use case, if you want to call it that, and really hasn't matured yet. So I think those are the big challenges for us at the moment. Are we okay there?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, leave it there.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
So Giovanna.
Already on? I don't, yeah, it's working already. And this is just, okay. Yeah, good. So the brief talk I'll give today is based on my work on the Internet of Toys, that is, toys that are connected to the Internet and equipped with a variety of sensors. And actually, Donnell Holloway and myself have started looking at this topic first theoretically, and then we did research. But already in the book that was published before we actually were given the opportunity to do more research on this kind of toys, we made the argument that internet-connected toys are toys, but they are also fundamentally media. What do we mean when we talk about media? We mean that they are doubly articulated in people's everyday lives as material artifacts, but especially as symbolic artifacts. They are media. But because of their being connected to networks, they gain a further layer of complexity. They are triply articulated, we would say. They gain a sort of agencies because they can collect and communicate data on their own. So if we look at the practices through which these toys are domesticated and used in context, we also have to bear in mind that it's not only users' practices we are looking at, but it's also the device, the toy practices, communicative practices, which data it is collecting and which data it is sharing. So if we look at internet-connected toys as media, we are interested in general in terms of wider social consequences to the topic of datafication. And here the issue is mainly what happens when a toy, which can be an intimate companion in children's everyday lives, can collect any sort of data on the surroundings and on the child itself. So intimate conversation that the child has with their own toys. But I won't actually go deeper into this, as the other panelists will probably explore more the privacy issues here at stake. My point is that actually all these privacy issues and datafication more generally are put in the background, are overshadowed by the nature of these toys as social robots. So when they are domesticated, actually their dimension as social robots prevails, and I'll give you some example of this. What does it mean that internet-connected toys are social robots? We know that social robots are those machines, those robots that are designed to interact with humans on an empathic level as if they were humans. So they enter in a communicative relationship. They mutually, so humans and robots mutually engage in a process of meaning production. They become meaningful to each other. Well, more radical theory about post-humanism or more than human theories argue that they are on an equal foot. This is not my personal view, but I realize, I understand, and I agree that the agency of the robot, the affordances of a social robot are actualized only through interaction. And Lucy Suchman suggested that both humans and robots are engaged in what she calls entity-making processes. They provoke each other, they test each other, as we will see. And so when these toys are domesticated, which means not only brought home, not only found a place in our everyday temporal routines, but also made meaningful for us, their social robotic nature prevails and is what is taken up more, and is what is also challenging in the current initial phase of domestication. They are not widespread yet. And they are challenging for us because we fail to make sense of their inadequacy, of their failures in a way, as I will show in a moment. So let me talk you more about the kind of toy we did research with. I'm not sure if you have ever seen it before. It's Cosmo. It's a very small robotic toy, actually one of the most powerful in terms of its agency. But what is interesting about this toy is that it is constructed, even in its commercial discourses, as a social robot. The main feature is its liveliness. It is presented as a lively creature. You can read, this is taken from the website, you can read it, it says, "Call him almost human." And of course, what they emphasize in the commercial discourse is all the liveliness and also the empathic relationship that children can create with this kind of toys. And this is exactly how it's been taken up, at least in the families that participated in my study. So what children enjoyed most was interacting with the toy so that the toy simulated its human life-like or animal-like characteristics. So the toy is programmed through an app. It's an app-enabled robot, and there's a section on the app where you can, which is called actually Cosmo Performs, where you can make Cosmo simulate a sort of human-like or animal-like sounds or movements. So it dances, it sings, it laughs, it mimics an elephant, a cat, and whatever. And this is actually what children enjoyed most. And in the way they domesticate Cosmo is basically, as I said, a process of meaning-making that is aimed at defining the boundaries of its new entity. So children recognize Cosmo as a hybrid entity which has an agency of its own. So actually they prefer technologies like the PlayStation much more. They get bored quite soon with Cosmo. But they recognize that compared to the PlayStation or YouTube or other digital media that they use, Cosmo is different because it has a sort of agency of its own. And they realize that there's an interplay between their own agency and the robot's agency. So, for example, another girl told me, well, you know, I tell Cosmo where to go and how to move through the app, but in a way, he knows where to go. And this girl, for example, I found it amazing, an amazing example of how challenging social robots are still for us. So she wanted to test Cosmo's agency and independent agency, and she tried to cover his screen, so his eyes. She knew actually that the sensors are not only positioned behind the screen, and she also knew that the Cosmos sees anyway because it's connected to the phone, which knows everything, the smartphone. But still, she wanted to test its liveliness as if it was an animal, a pet, a lively entity of some kind. And what's interesting in this stage of domestication is precisely what I mentioned before, so that we are not yet able to make sense of the machine failures. In a way, it's like we felt we need to adapt ourselves to the technology. It's us failing in communicating with the technology and not vice versa. So I don't understand what Cosmos says, because Cosmos speaks its own language that I need to understand. Or Cosmo failed to recognize me. Cosmo has voice and face recognition. It scans faces. But I remember during an interview, something went wrong, and the girl was not recognized. And she was very upset. But then she said, well, probably it's because I changed my glasses. And I also changed the style of my hair. So it's us were failing to communicate. It's not the machine, which is still something very magical, something very powerful. And related to the liveliness, there is another affordance that I called affective stickiness, borrowing, drawing on Deleuze. So the idea that material objects, and this is very true of toys for children, glue certain kinds of emotions and affect. So children are used to project feelings and emotion onto material objects. But the way that social robots differ from other kind of toys is that they demand these feelings. From the Tamagotchi onwards, they need to be taken care of. Otherwise, the Tamagotchi would die. Cosmo doesn't die, but Cosmo continues asking for attention, being fed, and you get notification on the app saying Cosmo is bored, he wants to play, please take care of him. And so that they encourage, in a more demanding way, children to develop this emotional relationship with toys, which is precisely why privacy issues are put in the background. So I think I've run out of time, so just to conclude, so there are two things. I'm not sure how many psychologists are in the audience, but psychologists would raise the issue of the new ontological category hypothesis, so the idea that we are still in the process of defining a new entity, which is lively but not human. And this has not only cognitive, but also moral consequences. But on a sociological and media communication perspective, I would say that the issue is also that these are media machines. They are intimate, part of everyday life, close as media, but they are machines. They become less transparent and in a way more magical, but also more dangerous. So it's through their empathic nature that we domesticate also the datafication aspect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Gilad, over to you.
Hi, morning. It's an honor to address all of you today. While I'm based in Spain, my opening comments will be focused in large part on the US context, with direct application to Europe as well. Oftentimes when discussing technology advancements in relation to children, the specter of the moral panic is raised. To be sure, a purely reactive think of the children response is unnuanced and unhelpful, but whether something is a moral panic versus a reasonable concern is a matter of orientation. In two dimensions, political orientation and regulatory philosophy, you can see this debate play out in the discourse of precaution. Last week, the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the executive branch, released a memorandum to the executive agencies on how they should regulate non-government uses of AI. This would include children's emotion analytics. It states, federal agencies must avoid regulatory or non-regulatory actions that needlessly hamper AI innovation and growth. Agencies must avoid a precautionary approach that holds AI systems to such an impossibly high standard that society cannot enjoy their benefits. Now, the focus of this panel and the technologies we're discussing are indeed innovative. New models of sensing in domestic and educational settings, new forms of relationship building between AI, toys, and children. But this framing, the contraposition of precaution against the benefits of innovation, is very familiar in American technology policy. And it reflects the US's frequent political distaste for the precautionary principle, which in Europe has been enshrined in Article 191 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU in regard to environmental policy. Directly opposing the precautionary principle is a discursive force in American technology policy called permissionless innovation, which sees what's been historically called command and control regulations as a problem, preferring instead non-regulatory, non-legislative, non-governmental solutions. Permissionless innovation has been defined as the notion that experimentation with new technologies and business models should generally be permitted by default, and the general freedom to experiment and learn through ongoing trial and error experimentation. The policy strategies of permissionless innovation are self-regulation, cost-benefit analysis, the need to show evidence of a harm before regulating, and regulatory humility, which is well expressed by a comment by Maureen Olhausen, former commissioner of the FTC, who said, "It is vital that government officials approach new technologies with a dose of regulatory humility by working hard to educate ourselves about the innovation, understand its effects on consumers in the marketplace, identify benefits and likely harms, and if harms do arise, consider whether existing laws and regulations are sufficient to address them before assuming that new rules are required." These are powerful ideas that get quite a bit of expression in Washington and other centers of governance. And while these positions align well with basic commercial logic to reduce regulatory burdens, they are also connected to the political orientation of libertarianism, which sees government as a dangerous institution, preferring instead market-led solutions. It is from this political quarter that we often hear of the concept of over-regulation. The ideological proponents of permissionless innovation describe the precautionary principle thusly: the belief that new innovation should be curtailed or disallowed until their developers can prove that they will not cause any harms, and that many critics adopt a mindset that views the future as something to be feared or avoided, or at least carefully planned. This is known as stasis mentality, and it is, at its root, what motivates precautionary principle-based thinking and policymaking. This is a politically charged, narrow reading of the precautionary principle, portraying it as a force for prohibition. Proponents of this view draw upon the work of Cass Sunstein, who in turn drew some of his ideas from law scholar Richard Stewart, who wrote about the precautionary principle in environmental regulation, which is where you see much of the legal, policy, and academic discussion of it. Stewart categorized the precautionary principle in 4 ways. The first is that scientific uncertainty should not automatically preclude regulation of activities that propose potential harm. Number 2 is that regulatory controls should incorporate a margin of safety. Number 3, that activities that present an uncertain potential for harm should be subject to best technology available. And number 4, that activities that present an uncertain potential for significant harm should be prohibited unless the proponent of the activity can prove otherwise. The first version of this principle is most famously given voice in the United Nations Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which says, where there are serious threats of irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. In regard to technologies that collect and analyze children's biometrics, I argue for far closer policy and discursive attention to the benefits of the precautionary principle. Luis Costa in 2012 helpfully outlined how this principle supports privacy and data protection. It addresses issues of information and power asymmetry, spurs public debate, recognizes that monetary damages for future harms may be inadequate, and takes account of scientific uncertainty. All of these benefits have direct and virtuous application to the surveillance and digital footprint of the emotional lives of children. The potential loss of children's bodily privacy and the possibility of a long-lived record of the challenging emotions of childhood are, to me, threats of serious or irreversible damage. Outright bans on new technology are rare, yet we are seeing a blossoming of facial recognition bans in law enforcement context, at least in the United States. Is this moral panic? Is it overreach? Is it overregulation? Or are they valid expressions of the precautionary principle? Again, this depends on your political and regulatory orientation, the degree to which you believe innovation needs to be safeguarded from precaution, and with whom you believe the burden of proof lies for showing that a technology will not harm people. In the research that Andy and I are currently working on, some of our respondents have voiced a support for a ban on using the emotional information learned from children in marketing to either them or their parents. It is unclear, though, whether such a ban would be politically feasible in the US or Europe. I offer that the concept of regulatory humility can sometimes be tantamount to the abdication of responsibility, that the cost-benefit orientation of regulating is unable to incorporate non-economic short and long-term social harms, and that the need to show a harm in advance of regulating can greatly advantage market actors at the expense of social values. As to uncertainty, reading biometric signals from children is new ground. The regulatory landscape for the protection of children will only be helped by policy efforts that slow things down. As to power and informational asymmetries, parents will likely suffer both in the commercial and educational market for these affective products. I have no fears of injury to innovation, especially as the benefits from children's emotion detection are nascent at best. The idea that precaution or privacy injures innovation is an orthodoxy that must be vigorously challenged. The precautionary principle interrogates the existing state of regulation and asks, are we governing enough? Permissionless innovation and its libertarian undercurrents reflect a faith that new technologies inevitably lead to human mastery and control over our environment, as Shannon Valor put it, and imagines that market forces and collective action are always superior to state power. The precautionary principle has enemies, and those enemies have adherents. In the overlapping domains of AI, IoT, and children's products, there is no better place for a robust reapplication of the precautionary principle to governing philosophy. Moral panics are real. Remember RFID chips? But the precautionary principle is based on prudence, not fear. It is grounded in a humility that knows that move fast and break things doesn't always work out so well. For those concerned about the social effects of the commercial collection of children's emotional data, a reinvigorated precautionary principle is a valuable rhetorical tool for the policy debates to come. Thank you.
I'm now faced with a very difficult question of whether I should stand or sit. Do they have the slides? I decided to stand. Welcome everyone, thanks for showing up so early in the morning. I would like to highlight a slightly different dimension of this topic that we're debating today. And that is the question. In the past year, a number of experts and papers have come out and raised concerns about the scientific foundations of affect and emotion recognition. This is one paper that has been widely covered by the news that you see here, but also the latest report of the AI Now Institute in New York includes an entire section called Flawed Scientific Foundation. This section identifies both, on the one hand, face recognition, on the other hand, some forms of affect recognition as growing areas of concern. I think this is a fascinating trend that's happening at the moment, because if you take the extreme view that the technology is fundamentally flawed, and I'm being deliberately provocative now, why are we debating its consequences? If it's not working at all, why should we talk about its privacy implications? I think the question about the technology's scientific foundations also has profound implications for how we should respond to it and how we should regulate it. If something is fundamentally flawed, it should not be marketed and deployed for the purposes that it claims it can do. If it is merely imperfect, its use should be limited to certain contexts, and depending on the context, we need appropriate safeguards. But these two avenues are radically different, and this is the reason why it's very important that we know exactly what it is that we're talking about. So in this presentation, I would like to raise 3 short and different points. The first one is, I would briefly like to address the concerns that are raised about emotion and affect recognition. The second point I'd like to raise is, I think I'd like to talk about the implications this has for trustworthy AI more generally. And finally, I would like to make a proposal, which is very much work in progress and part of my fellowship project at Mozilla. So these are some of the concerns that are raised about affect recognition technology. And these points are very much from stem from the AI Now report, but they have been repeated in different contexts. So the first concern that is raised about the technology is that, apologies, sorry. So the first concern is that context matters. So researchers at Berkeley found that in order to detect emotions with accuracy and high agreement, this requires context beyond the face and the body. Yet we see that plenty of tools rely either exclusively on the face or use the face in combination with some data from the body. The second criticism is, and this is closely related, a major review this summer found that efforts to read out people's internal states from an analysis of facial movements alone, without considering any context, are at best incomplete and at worst lack any kind of scientific validity. And thirdly, there's a third concern, which is that there's a large variance in how people communicate their emotions across cultures, across situations, and even across people within a single situation. In addition to all of this, there are very specific concerns raised about children that make it more complicated. So what are the lessons from this? One conclusion we could draw is that everything is flawed, we should ban it. But I think these three specific points, what they actually show is that what we're faced with is a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, we have entirely flawed technology that we could call snake oil AI. But on the other hand, in the middle, we have very incomplete, overly simplistic uses of that technology. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have improving rough approximations. So what does it mean for trustworthy AI more generally? I think the first lesson that we should draw from this debate about emotion AI is that there are very different harms depending on whether a technology works as it is intended or whether it does not work as it is intended. So we talk on the one hand, when the technology works as it is intended, we can talk about the harvesting of emotion. There are always false positives and false negatives. We can talk about manipulation and privacy. But we have an entirely different spectrum of problems when the technology doesn't work as it is intended. And the problem is that there are often misunderstandings about which one is which. I think the second lesson about trustworthy AI is that we are surrounded by very dubious claims about technology's capabilities. And I've selected 3 of my favorite ones. And my absolute favorite one is that you can take a DNA test to find out housemates compatible with your personality traits. And I think the most infamous of these examples is probably a study that probably everybody in this audience knows, that AI can guess whether you're gay or straight from a photograph alone. There are 2 concerns with the fact that we're surrounded by very dubious claims about what technology can do. The first one is that claims either made by studies or by companies are often reported without any critical discussions about whether these technologies actually work. But the second one is that some of these claims actually stick around, and this is why I still find the gay faces study so fascinating, is because it keeps on coming up. So this was just last year, a podcast on Wired.com cited the study as, yes, AI can detect whether we're gay or straight, even though this has been a widely discussed study with counter studies and countless of experts claiming that this is actually not possible. But a related issue is that we also see that evidently flawed technology is being deployed. And this is a great example from the journalist Eva Kaufman, who looked at the science behind vocal risk assessment. So there are companies that claim from the sound of your voice, we can determine whether someone is a terrorist or a risky person. This is clearly not beyond the capability of the technology. So what's the lesson from this? In December, the computer scientist Arvind Narayanan has come up with a framework for how to recognize and detect AI snake oil. And I think I agree with 90% of this framework, and I think it is very interesting because he makes a distinction between areas of the technology where we're seeing genuine rapid progress. There are areas where judgments are being automated. What he doesn't mention, which I think is important to add, is that this is inherently normative, and that comes with its own problems. But then there's a third category, which is called predicting social outcomes. So predicting whether predictive policing falls under this, predicting whether somebody's a terrorist threat. These are just, and the way he explains it, I can't do it justice in the time we have, but his argument is basically basic statistics would come to the same results, but it would be a lot more transparent. So the proposal that I want to conclude with is, I think we, and with we I mean on the one hand journalists, but also regulators, and the discourse on this emerging technology more broadly, we need to be better at recognizing what is genuine in snake oil and distinguishing it from the inherent risk that imperfect technology has. And this is work in progress, but what I would like to I think the framework that has been proposed is very useful, but it needs to be elaborated and expanded. So one addition would be, I think, for automating judgment, it's important to say that these are inherently normative. For predicting outcomes, what this is essentially about is predicting the future. But the thing I would like to add is what is inherently problematic, and this clearly goes beyond affect. This is sort of some of the purposes for which effective technology is being deployed, are sort of assessments that judge people's intentions, so whether somebody is lying, and we've seen this used in hiring technology, or assessing someone's identity. And the reasons why these are not impossible tasks, but they are inherently problematic, the reason why they are problematic is that we should be the ultimate authority about who we are. So it is up to me to decide what my sexual orientation is, no matter what any test says, because this is an assertion of my identity. And the same goes to judging intentions. There is an inner life that we only have the authority to assert. So any kind of mass deployments that say I can detect whether you are deceitful or whether you're a risk are inherently problematic. And I think this matters, going back to the focus of this panel, this matters especially when we use tools in the context of education or schools, because this is where the consequences are. We are using technology on people who are very vulnerable.
Cool. Thank you so much, Frederike. Okay, so we have lots of time for questions now. I see one hand up already. I believe one will need to move to the microphone. Sorry, Charles. Okay. Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much. Is this on?
It doesn't sound like it.
Is it on now? Good. Thanks very much. Charles Robb from the University of Edinburgh. I found this a very interesting panel indeed, and it got something from all of the talks. I want to address a question, I think perhaps particularly to Ben and also to maybe Frederike. I'm particularly interested both in research and some practical activities of mine in the world of law enforcement and policing. And my question is this: do either of you know of any police forces, law enforcement agencies, and so on, who are interested in emotional recognition, in the kinds of stuff that you've been talking about, to the point where they're considering using them in either predictive policing or other kinds of facial recognition systems, and therefore might be trying them out and evaluating them? I'd be very interested to know if there are actually instances in which people are trying to make a use case out of this. Thank you.
I can go first if you like. There's bound to be a lot of things that we haven't heard of, that are out there that may already be deployed. But we've certainly sort of had conversations and not followed up on, but with both technology companies and those technology companies working with governments and whatnot, mostly in other countries, who are looking at that. And facial coding, so face-based systems was the sort of main one, because it's the easiest way in. There are CCTV cameras throughout cities all over the world. So their sort of notion is that if they can add on these layers of algorithmic processing behind the video feeds, then there are all kinds of things you could theoretically determine, such as is a crowd starting to look like it's getting aggressive, and therefore we should deploy policing to that area. So I've certainly seen had that conversation, and also I know that there have been technologies deployed on border control, for instance, that have applied facial coding to detect potentially aggressive actors on border control, and heard claims that they were accurate in some way, but I find that interesting and doubtful. But I haven't seen the actual technology in action. One of the questions that this raises, of course, is this idea of predictive policing. There's a case probably to state that if you could accurately detect that public danger was there, then maybe you would put extra police in the place at the time. But beyond that, I can see it easily being exploited, and I'm hugely doubtful about the ability of the technology right now to provide much accuracy. One last point on that, I suppose, is accuracy statistics are hugely deceptive, right? And one of the main points there, I suppose, let's say you're trying to detect a terrorist in a crowd of faces just using facial recognition, let alone emotion detection. False, I always get this wrong around. We can expect false positives, and therefore people will be detained unnecessarily, and time will be wasted. It's frustrating. It's invasion of privacy and so on. But then there are false negatives are generally just not even measured, because the only way you could measure it is by finding out who in the crowd is actually a terrorist and then checking it against your statistics. So they just don't even get mentioned. So a high rate of false negative there could actually mean you're missing somebody who then causes harm. It almost negates the technology in the first place, potentially.
And just to add, I think it's what is suspicious. There's no one way to define what suspicious is. And that means a lot of assumptions about what normal behavior is and what abnormal behavior is go into the definition of such models. And the same, not just in policing, but also in the hiring or job application process. What does it mean that somebody is deceptive? There's not one clear definition of this, and that's one of the reasons that it's so problematic.
Hello, it was an excellent, sorry?
So can I just have a question from the back first and then the front?
Thank you. I wanted to ask the panel collectively what you think about the duty and the role of education in this, because we are talking about very, very important issues, but we're talking about future generations and children who've been brought up with technology, trust technology, know nothing else but technology. Is there a space in education, both higher and primary education, in making children, young adults, more alert to the possibilities? Should we be embedding this more as part of technology-based education?
Yeah, thank you. Is it working? Yeah, you can hear. Thank you for this very relevant question. This is actually what my work is mainly concerned with. So the idea that growing up with these technology, children tend to normalize them, to give them for granted, and not to be critical towards them. And there's a lot of debate on media literacy, or in this specific field, data literacy. But I would say that the problem with media education and media literacy discourse, I believe that it's vital, it's crucial, so there's need for more media education in schools and even in families, so among parents. But there's also this individualizing framework and individual responsibility framework that places the burden of privacy on the individual. So in the case of children, onto parents and educators, onto parents and school, as a scapegoat to avoid regulation. I think we need both. We need education, of course. We need to educate critical citizens, but we need regulation as well. Because otherwise, the way these technologies are sold on the market through gamification and empathic media and social robots and so on, help us domesticate and become familiar with these technologies without questioning their dangers.
Gilad, do you have a follow-up there? Just on the permissionless innovation point.
So I'm actually, I completely agree with Giovanna in the challenges of pushing privacy self-management onto people. Now, I was interpreting your question a little bit more broadly in the sense of creating norms and greater understanding in society about technology, which I'm definitely for, and I believe that that's necessary. Obviously, the more nuance we have in the understanding of the technologies around us, the more rich our discussions about them will be, and that includes governance. So, you know, as Andy said, you know, and Giovanna said, you know, we need both. We need both greater understanding amongst the populace about these technologies and what they can and cannot do, and to Frederike's point, what's snake oil and what's not. And obviously, the earlier you can start to educate people, the adults of the future, about these technologies, then as they grow into maturity and these technologies inevitably advance, they will hopefully have a more nuanced perspective on what these technologies are.
Well, this is a wonderful panel. I learned a lot, but the accuracy aspects raised some concerns because I think they are related to the concept of the emotion itself. Because we are getting close to neuroscience approach, which is basically mapping bodily field aspects, and emotions, since Aristotle, are thought as a rational and cognitive appraisal of reality. And so I think accuracy it's maybe a problem because the same bodily patterns may call to different emotions or different moods. And this is not just for the basic emotions, this is for moods and distractions, or bodily temperature can raise, well, for various numbers of reasons. So I think why doesn't the approach goes that far to cognitive aspects and not just for bodily feelings? This is a provocation. And then 2 questions about toys and autonomous cars. Well, in those realities, we are likely profiling children and drivers, or even if a car is used in a company or within a family, various members may use it and the different patterns can be detected. So this raises transparency issues on data protection field. So how is this information provided as to parents, children, and drivers? So this is my question. Thank you.
I think to answer your question about how this profiling information is being gathered and then what's being done with it, I think that's an unanswered question at the moment because different organizations are approaching it from different angles. I think it was BMW or something recently released a public statement along the lines of, we don't want your data, we're not a data company, which I thought was an interesting statement. I don't know how much that plays out. The way I always see it is there's this compromise between, like, in one version of things you could have it so that everything that could be known about a person is known about them in data form, and it is then shared across some global infrastructure, and therefore, you know, smart city environments, toys in the home, whatever, are as informed as they could possibly be and get better and better and better at interacting with you for some kind of personal gain, right? Sounds lovely. But the opportunities for exploitation, for commercial gains or for government gain and whatnot are enormous. So I don't have an answer as to where that is at the moment. I think it's very challenging. There are some technical sort of drivers behind whether something should be run on the edge or fed back into the cloud, for instance. it makes sense at the moment with sort of bandwidth issues for the vehicle to actually scrub a lot of that information, such as the video images, before sending up just the sort of processed insights up to the cloud server. But even those insights can be very personal. And then I would just round that back to your point that actually, even before you start talking about children's own sophistication with their own emotions, there's still an open question as to quite what emotions are and what they mean and you know and how we define them for highly sophisticated adults. So there's a big sophistication and agency question there that I think is unsolved, and I think a lot of it for companies is about how they design the interaction with the user, but what's driving them to make their users highly sophisticated? Not a hell of a lot. Sometimes they just want to make the product easy and fun, you know. So I don't.
Yes, I'm Simone van der Hof from Leiden University, and thanks very much for a very interesting panel. I have two questions. So I'm very happy for you to bring in the broader perspective, both Gilad and Frederike, about the precautionary principle and regulating AI and all the things that brings with it. My first question is, to what extent has the children's rights perspective actually been conceptualized and maybe even operationalized in respect of them? Because children are not adults, and the children's rights perspective has some particular impact. And my second question, so I like the broader perspective, but bringing it back to privacy and data protection, we know that privacy and data protection in Europe are grounded in some principles, including the principle of necessity and proportionality, which is also about effectiveness, and this was an issue also with the technologies that we're talking about today. To what extent do you think that these principles will already help us to sort of slow down or maybe even stop some of these developments? To what extent are these principles effective in doing that? So thank you.
Just to throw in one, I think what we haven't mentioned at all is that there are applications that where you can argue about it, but that arguably do not identify people, and that raises privacy questions that don't necessarily fall under the domain of data protection. And a couple of years ago, there was an excellent panel on this at CPDP, which explored this question. So this raises, I think this is very interesting, given that the Commission's leaked draft AI proposal said instead of a ban, we should strengthen data protection. That raises the question, what do we do if something falls out of the scope? That's one thing. And the other thing is sort of like grounded in children. I think the idea that it's your right to assert your identity or who you are, the reason why one of the many reasons why children are considered particularly vulnerable is that they haven't fully formed yet, and they should have the right to reinvent themselves, even more so than adults should. But I'm not an expert on children.
So I just want to firstly say that in Giovanna's book is an excellent chapter that covers a lot of the children's rights domains and how they are interplaying with the existing regulatory frameworks. And I definitely could not do better than that chapter. It's excellent, and it's Eva and Evelyn, and they're both here at the conference. So you know, and I think that we know that the GDPR has taken has taken a steer from COPPA in the United States to some degree because COPPA is specifically about children, and so it is rather well developed policy. Its effectiveness aside, yes or no, it is actually a body of developed policy in relation to digital activities of children. Now, the U.S.'s perspective on policymaking does not take the same exact type of principle orientation as it does in Europe. So it's going to be, I think, difficult to assess the effectiveness, because you mentioned things like proportionality and these different principles that underscore European policymaking, and I guess that it's also kind of important to look at existing policies that have emerged and whether or not they adhere to those types of principles. You look at the cookie regulation, which everybody sort of points to as perhaps not the most effective regulatory tool, and it is an example of showing how the principles, whether they exist or not, whether they are referenced or not, may or may not make it into the regulation.
Sorry. No, I just wanted to briefly add that if you're interested in the children's rights framework, then I would recommend you to attend a panel later with my colleague and friend Sonia Livingston. She has worked extensively on that. Then you reminded me of the GDPR and the way it is difficult to actually respect children's rights in regulation. So, for example, one of the major debates surrounding Article 8 of the GDPR in terms from a children's rights perspective was that it's actually defending their right to protection, but probably not their right to participation and self-expression. So it's controversial. And the other, a colleague that Gilad was referring to is Eva Levens, and she will be here tomorrow, I think.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions.
Hi, I'm Jen Person. I'm from Defend Digital Me, the privacy group in England, particularly focused on education. The ICO has today brought out the age-appropriate code of practice, and it will look at how children's data protection works across much of this field. But my fundamental question is, does the panel think that data protection is sufficient protection for children as they develop into adulthood? And should we not be looking more fundamentally at protecting their privacy and the right to be forgotten at age 18 as default across much of these technologies? Can we not champion their privacy better by saying at age 18, the default should be data falls away from commercial companies, that you have the right to be forgotten by default as a child, and that only with your express permission should that data follow you into adulthood?
I like this idea. And funnily enough, it was at least 5 years ago or more where Eric Schmidt suggested the exact same thing. He suggested, and it, of course, being a tremendous irony coming from his mouth, suggested that perhaps at 18 children get a big reset button, which is, I think, tantamount to the idea of an automatic right to be forgotten at age 18. I do not believe that is regulatorily feasible, not in the political climate that we see. It is an attractive idea, and I think it points to the recognition of the sensitivity of the data that's collected by companies of children. Obviously, you run into issues about 16 versus 18 versus what is the child's wish. As my presentation might have indicated, I am all for creative, broad regulatory considerations on these topics. And as Frederike was saying, the very easy possibility for these types of activities to fall outside of the scope and the letter of the law of data protection would seem to necessitate exactly the kind of approach you're suggesting.
I would still like to add that I think there is a tendency for us who work in this space to think about applications that are designed for data harvesting. And then the idea is you're a person, and then there's a company that has a database of how I felt at any point in time. I think that is clearly something that is, there's clearly business case and interest in this. But I also think we should consider what are the privacy implications when this isn't happening. Is my privacy still being invaded? And I think it is. Sort of like when I'm walking across a space and and something reacts to my presumed emotion, it is still invasive, no matter whether the data is being stored or not. So I think these are really important questions too.
Okay, maybe one final super quick question. Okay, I'm going to abuse my moderator position then. I'm going to ask the panel to respond very quickly to this one question. Is use of child data regarding emotion for interaction with toys innately wrong? Ben?
Innately dangerous, yes, I think so. I think the sort of term that keeps coming up into my mind is this idea of sophisticated agency. So the ability to actually make sensible judgments about the technology you're using. And I don't think most technologically advanced adults are even able to do that with current technology, let alone children with new types of subtle, intimate technology.
Giovanna?
Wow. Difficult to answer very, very quickly. But I'm especially concerned with the future implications. So what happens when these data are used to profile children in a way that will actually regulate their access to future opportunities like education or job opportunities or health and whatever.
Frederike?
Going back to my core question that I'm thinking about at the moment is what struck me in your amazing presentation was the claim that is being made is that these tools encourage emotional interaction and engagement. And it immediately made me think about Tamagotchis. And so do we really need this in order to fulfill this purpose? And I think in all considerations of the risk, we should not lose sight of the fact, does the tool do what it says it does?
I'm not qualified to say whether or not I feel that the child themselves would be negatively affected by such type of play. What I find dangerous is the collection of the information.
Okay, so it remains for me to say thank you very much to Ben, Giovanna, Gilad, Frederike, and thank you to the room.